Most people think Ted Bundy outsmarted the justice system, that he was a criminal mastermind, that his intelligence, charm, and legal knowledge kept him one step ahead. But that story falls apart the moment you look closely. Before the trials, before the escapes, and before the headlines. Ted Bundy was a failed law student, a man deeply angry about rejection, and a serial predator whose crimes left a trail of young women missing across Washington, Utah, and Colorado. In this episode, we're going to go back to the beginning, to the first confirmed attacks in 1974, to the witnesses who saw him in broad daylight, to the survivors who identified him in court, and to the investigation that nearly stopped him before he became infamous. This is Ted Bundy for the Defense, and this is Part 1. I'm Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime, and this is our new series, Ted Bundy for the Defense. If you're joining me for the first time, or if it's been a few days since the introduction, welcome back. In the last episode, I introduced this series by dismantling the mythology surrounding Ted Bundy. The idea that he was some uniquely brilliant legal mind, that he outsmarted the justice system, and that his charm was his greatest weapon. What we'll see over the course of this series is something far less cinematic and far more disturbing. Instead, you'll learn about a man driven by grievance, entitlement, and fantasy, who believed he was an exception, even as his own failures stacked up around him. Today, we begin at the point where fantasy became violence. By the early 1970s, Ted Bundy was a man deeply invested in how he appeared to others. On paper, he looked like someone on the rise. He'd graduated from the University of Washington in 1972 with a degree in psychology, earning honors. He worked in politics, volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline. But beneath that carefully managed image was a pattern of rejection and disappointment. Bundy had always wanted prestige. He aspired to an elite education, elite connections, and elite status. And again, he fell short. His academic path was erratic. He dropped out of college more than once. His LSAT scores were mediocre. The top law schools rejected him. When he was finally accepted into law school, it wasn't, in his opinion, the caliber of school where he thought he belonged. And threaded throughout all of this was a woman named Diane Edwards. To Bundy, Diane was the type of woman he deserved. He later described Diane as the only woman I ever really loved. She was accomplished, confident, and socially polished. Everything he wanted to be. When she broke off their relationship in 1968, citing his lack of ambition and immaturity, it appears to have left a deep wound. Years later, after Bundy finally graduated with a degree in psychology, he decided to win back his fantasy woman. He re-entered her life and presented himself as transformed, politically connected, and academically successful. Diane, impressed by his growth and newfound maturity, was willing to give him another chance, and they began dating long distance, with Ted in Washington and Diane living in California. Over the course of a few weeks, they began discussing marriage. He introduced her to others as his fiancée. And then, in January of 1974, he disappeared. When Diane finally reached him by phone weeks later and demanded an explanation, Bundy responded calmly, "Diane, I have no idea what you're talking about." And he hung up. It's difficult not to see this moment as a pivot point. Many investigators and psychologists believe that Bundy's violence was, in part, an attempt to reenact that original rejection over and over again on women who resembled Diane. Young, thin, long brown hair parted in the middle, college-educated, and independent. Women who symbolized what he believed had been denied to him. The cruelty he showed his first love, charming and wooing her back, only to drop her without explanation, didn't satisfy this urge for revenge. Bundy escalated his need for control into dark, violent fantasies, which he soon began to act upon. The first confirmed Bundy attack occurred on January 4, 1974. 18-year-old Karen Sparks was asleep in her basement apartment near the University of Washington campus when a man broke in. He bludgeoned her with a metal rod and sexually assaulted her, leaving her unconscious and critically injured. Karen survived, but barely. She suffered permanent brain damage. This attack didn't fit neatly into later Bundy narratives because it didn't end in murder, but it was brutal, frenzied, and personal. It showed rage rather than calculation. Less than a month later, Bundy would escalate. On February 1, 1974, Lynda Ann Healy vanished from her basement bedroom. She was a popular University of Washington student, known for her kindness and reliability. She never made it to work that morning. For months, her disappearance baffled investigators. Her remains wouldn't be found until more than a year later, dumped in a remote area of the Taylor Mountains. After Lynda disappeared, the pace accelerated. In March, Donna Gail Manson vanished from Evergreen State College. In April, Susan Rancourt disappeared while walking to her dorm. In May, Roberta Parks vanished from Oregon State University. In June, Brenda Ball disappeared after visiting a tavern near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. 10 days later, Georgianne Hawkins vanished from the University of Washington campus. At first, these cases weren't linked. Young women disappeared all the time, investigators reasoned. They ran away. They met boyfriends. They started new lives. But the pattern was there. College-aged, brown hair, similar body types, similar circumstances. And somewhere in the background, a quiet detail kept surfacing. A man named Ted. The day that changed everything was July 14, 1974. At Lake Sammamish State Park, dozens of people reported encounters with a friendly young man. He had his arm in a sling. He asked for help loading a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. Several women found him off-putting and odd and walked away. 2 did not. Janice Ott was abducted in broad daylight. Hours later, Bundy returned and abducted Denise Naslund. Witnesses watched him walk away with the women. This time, when women came up missing, there was a face and a name to put to a suspect: Ted. There was even a description of his vehicle: a tan Volkswagen Beetle. For the first time, investigators had something concrete, and Bundy knew it. Within weeks, he packed up and left Washington State. 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared on October 2nd. 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith vanished on October 18th. 17-year-old Laura Aime disappeared on Halloween. Melissa's father was the Midvale police chief. Her body was found 9 days later. Evidence suggested she had been kept alive for days before being killed. Laura Aime's remains were discovered weeks later. The medical examiner believed she may have survived for nearly 20 days after her abduction. Bundy would later confess to killing Nancy Wilcox, though her body was never found. By now, investigators were dealing with a predator who wasn't just killing. He was prolonging his dark fantasies, acting out the torture and violence on his victims over days or weeks. On November 8, 1974, Bundy made a mistake. 18-year-old Carol Durant was shopping at a mall in Murray, Utah, when a man approached her, identifying himself as a police officer. He said someone had tried to break into her car and asked her to come with him. He led her out to the parking lot and told her he'd drive her to a police station in his vehicle to complete a formal report. She thought this was odd, but he was an officer of the law, she reasoned, so she followed him to his vehicle. She was surprised to see not a police cruiser, but an older model VW Beetle. Wary, she asked to see some form of ID to verify he was a cop. He chuckled and quickly flashed a badge clipped to his billfold. Still suspicious, but like many young women, accustomed to obeying authority figures without question, she got in. Inside the vehicle, he handcuffed her. And then Carol fought back. She escaped, running for her life, with one hand still cuffed. She gave police a detailed description of Officer Roseland. For the first time, a victim survived and remembered everything. Later that evening, he abducted 17-year-old Deborah Kent from a school parking lot a few miles away. The key matching the handcuffs used to restrain Carol Durant was found lying in the parking lot. Witnesses reported that a man had asked at least 2 people to come outside to identify a car, but they had declined. A man matching Bundy's description was also seen pacing behind the school auditorium shortly before Deborah Kent went missing. The net was tightening. And Ted Bundy, the man who believed he could outthink everyone, was about to step into the role he'd always imagined for himself, although not the way he'd intended. By late 1974, investigators in Utah were no longer working in isolation. The composite sketch of Ted, the suspect with the MO of luring young women away through various deceptions, a man who drove a tan Volkswagen Beetle, had circulated widely. And with it came something law enforcement had not anticipated in such volume: tips from people who thought they recognized him as a Ted they knew. Tips came in not just from the public, but from Ted's friends, co-workers, neighbors, and girlfriends. In November, one of those calls came from Washington State. Elizabeth Klopfer, known as Liz, had lived with Ted Bundy off and on for years. She had shared a home with him, raised her young daughter around him, and believed she knew him better than anyone. She told police something that immediately caught their attention. Her Ted matched the description. Her Ted drove a tan Volkswagen. Her Ted had recently moved to Utah. Liz explained that after the Lake Sammamish murders, she'd noticed the similarities and even joked about it with Bundy. But as reports of missing women followed him east, the unease turned into fear. Investigators took her statement seriously. By this point, they had received hundreds of tips from people who suspected someone close to them. Most led nowhere. Still, Liz's information was added to the growing Bundy file. And for the first time, Theodore Robert Bundy was no longer just a person of interest. He was a viable suspect. In early 1975, Bundy pushed farther east. On January 12th, Karen Campbell disappeared from the Wildwood Inn at Snowmass, Colorado. On March 15th, Julie Cunningham vanished while walking to her apartment in Vail. On April 16th, Denise Alverson was last seen hitchhiking in Grand Junction. Once again, the pattern followed the man. Utah investigators noticed something chilling. The murders in their state had stopped shortly after Bundy left, and now young women were disappearing in Colorado. The geography shifted, the method remained. In the early morning hours of August 15, 1975, a patrol officer in Granger, Utah, noticed a tan Volkswagen slowly cruising a residential neighborhood. The driver appeared to be casing homes. When the officer activated his lights and siren, the driver fled. He was quickly caught. Behind the wheel was Ted Bundy. A search of the vehicle revealed items that would later become infamous: garbage bags, an ice pick, a flashlight, gloves, a mask made from pantyhose with eye holes cut out, and a pair of handcuffs. Bundy was arrested for evading an officer and possession of burglary tools. It wasn't enough to hold him for long, but it was enough to begin connecting the dots. Bundy rose to the top of the suspect list. On October 2, 1975, Bundy was placed in a lineup. Despite a change in his hairstyle, 3 witnesses identified him as the man seen on November 8, 1974, the day Carol Durant escaped and Deborah Kent vanished. A teacher and a student from Viewmont High School recalled the man lingering near the auditorium, and Carol Durant, without hesitation, identified Bundy as Officer Roseland. Bundy was charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted murder. His bail was set at $100,000. 2 weeks later, The attempted murder charge was dropped due to insufficient evidence. Bundy's bail was reduced to $15,000, and he walked free. Now under surveillance, Bundy treated the investigation like a sport. He waved to officers assigned to watch him. He wore disguises. He sent them food and coffee while they sat outside his apartment. To Bundy, this was all still a game. In November of 1975, investigators from 5 states met in Aspen, Colorado. Washington, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, and Idaho. They compared notes. Victims had been struck from behind. They were found nude. They showed signs of sexual assault and mutilation. They were young, attractive, and shared similar physical features. Credit card receipts placed Bundy in the same locations where women vanished. Hair found in his Volkswagen was deemed microscopically indistinguishable from that of Melissa Smith and a Colorado victim. Individually, the evidence was circumstantial. Together, it was devastating. He was referred to criminal attorney John Henry Brown. When Bundy arrived at Brown's office and gave his name to his receptionist, she quit on the spot. The name Ted Bundy was already in the papers. The Seattle newspapers were running headlines asking, "Is the Utah Ted the Seattle Ted?" When Brown warned him of this, Bundy smirked and said, "If they haven't put it together by now, they never will." Brown found that statement deeply troubling. Bundy immersed himself in law books, fixated on search and seizure law and eyewitness fallibility. He filed motions to suppress evidence and dismiss charges. All were denied. His attorney requested that he take a polygraph test. Bundy agreed and failed. This surprised Bundy, who told the attorney that he was sure he would pass the polygraph because his personality type could fool the machine. When Brown asked why he need to fool the test if he were innocent, Bundy replied, "It's just a game." Brown would later describe Bundy as a man playing a role, badly. He dressed like an Ivy League law student, mimicked Brown's mannerisms, and even bought identical shoes. Bundy wasn't preparing a defense. He was rehearsing an identity. Bundy's trial for the aggravated kidnapping of Carol Durant began on February 23, 1976. He hired Utah's top criminal defense attorney, John O'Connell, paid for by his parents and friends. O'Connell urged him to waive his right to a jury trial because of the overwhelming publicity. Bundy agreed. Judge Stuart Hansen would decide his fate. Against all advice, Bundy insisted on testifying. He believed his charm would prevail. Instead, he unraveled. He lied about never being in Colorado, contradicted by credit card receipts. He offered implausible explanations for the items found in his car. He was caught fabricating details under direct questioning. Carol Durant, in contrast, never wavered. Judge Hansen found her entirely credible. On March 1, 1976, he delivered the verdict. "I find the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, guilty of aggravated kidnapping." Bundy was stunned. In the courtroom were his parents, Liz Klopfer, Midvale Police Chief Lewis Smith, whose daughter Melissa had been murdered, and Deborah Kent's parents. They believed justice had finally begun. On June 30th, Bundy was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. Because it was technically his first conviction, he could be eligible for parole in as little as 18 months. Even then, Bundy remained smug. He dismissed warnings that investigators were still building cases against him. There were no strong cases, he insisted, but he was wrong. Bundy had already sold his Volkswagen, the car investigators called the Death Wagon. What he didn't know was that Colorado investigators had now tracked it down and were dismantling it. As Bundy entered prison, the VW was being transported to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Inside it, they found a trove of evidence. And as the walls began to close in, Ted Bundy would soon make one of the most reckless decisions of his life. By the time Ted Bundy was convicted in Utah, many believed the danger was over. But investigators in multiple states were only just beginning to uncover the full scope of his crimes. And Bundy himself was already preparing his next move. In Part 2, we'll follow the evidence that tied him to additional murderers, the forensic discoveries inside his Volkswagen, and the decision that allowed Ted Bundy to take control of his own defense, with consequences that would shock the nation. If you want to continue this series, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss part 2. And if you prefer to listen on the go, you can find Once Upon a Crime wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Once Upon a Crime podcast on your favorite podcast app, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.